Our speakers today are Frank Schneider. Frank's a board member of the Pennsylvania 4R Alliance and is Pennsylvania's Director of Nutrient and Odor Management Programs. Frank oversees the implementation of those programs, providing technical, administrative, and programmatic guidance to participants, conservation district staff and boards, the press, ag industry representatives, as well as the general public. He oversees the development of program policy and regulation and assists with legal issues related to the nutrient and odor management programs, as well as activities involving the Environmental Hearing Board. One of our other speakers also presenting today is Mark Goodson. Mark is also a board member of the Pennsylvania 4R Alliance and is state agronomist for USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, in Pennsylvania, following a varied career in agriculture, including international assignments. And finally, Eric Rosenbaum is an experienced agronomist who owns and operates Rosetree Consulting. Eric and his wife, Brooke Rosenbaum, are co-executive directors of the Pennsylvania 4R Alliance. There will be time to ask the speakers questions after their presentation. I wanted to thank you, Frank, Mark, and Eric, and thanks to all of you who are here to learn today. I'll bring up the presentation now and I'll let Frank begin.
Thanks, Brian, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'll be speaking to you today on the regulatory portions of the presentation. Mark Goodson will come in and speak a little bit about how the federal program complements the state regulations. And then Eric Rosenbaum will be bringing it at home on how you take what's required of you by law and how you put that into your plans and conversations and make the plan a better document for your client. So with that, next slide here, Brian, please. Really the basis, what we'll be talking about first is erosion and sediment control. In Pennsylvania, that's our Chapter 102 program. And you can also meet erosion and sediment control through conservation planning, which is an NRCS document. Second section that we'll talk about is manure and nutrient planning. Act 38, which is the program that I oversee, is our nutrient management program. And Chapter 91 was for everybody else that's not under Act 38 that has manure, the manure management program. And then Eric will be bringing it home with crop planning plus, using 4R agronomic principles within the regulations to make decisions and increase profitability. Next slide, please, Brian. So really the basis for the Pennsylvania regulations is the Pennsylvania Clean Streams Law. In 1937, we enacted in Pennsylvania, we enacted the Clean Streams Law. And the purpose of that is to regulate any discharge which may cause or contribute to pollution of waters of the Commonwealth. And it establishes the basic authority to protect streams from pollution for the benefit of Pennsylvania's citizens and environment. We also have Pennsylvania's Constitution, Article 1, Section 27, which was amended in 1971. We had the Environmental Rights Amendment to that. And what that says in our Constitution is the people have a right to clean air, pure water, and the preservation of all natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all people, including generations yet to come. As trustees of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all people. Next slide, please. So the next thing we're going to talk about is our Chapter 102 program. This is under DEP's regulations. And what Chapter 102 is erosion and sediment pollution control. You will probably know it better on construction sites, land development sites. You'll see silt fence up or silt barriers or something like that. That's part of Chapter 102. But there is a provision in Chapter 102 regulations for agricultural activities. And next slide here, please, Eric. So we'll dig into the agricultural activities part of it. And what that says, bear with me here. What that says is any operation with plowable or tillable land to include no-till operations, or any operation with an animal heavy use area, such as a barnyard, feedlot, loafing area, exercise slot, or other similar area on an agricultural operation, because the concentration of animals and it's not possible to establish and maintain vegetative cover in a way to minimize accelerated erosion and sedimentation. Just need to make sure in that animal heavy use areas, it does not include entrances and pathways or walkways or between where the animals are housed or where they're kept in concentration or when they're going out to pastures. So you need to have a conservation or an ag erosion and sediment control plan if you have plowing and tilling, you're doing any kind of cropping because it includes no-till, and you have animal heavy use areas. There is you need to have a combination of more than 5,000 square feet for BMPs to be implemented and for the plan to be written. If it's less than 5,000 square feet, you just need to have BMPs. You don't need to have a written plan. There are very few people that would have less than 5,000 square feet. The only people that's really applicable to is a smaller home garden. Anyone else probably needs an agricultural erosion sediment control plan. So you need to have that plan be a written plan, and you need to have BMPs or best management plan practices either planned or installed to minimize accelerated erosion and sedimentation on the farm. Next slide, please. So what the Chapter 102, what the regulations, what the erosion sediment control plan is going to look at is going to look at sheet and rill erosion. That's the flow of the erosional flow over the entire field. And it needs to meet the tolerable soil loss, or T, over the rotation. So it does. We do know that there will be erosion on crop fields. There's a tolerable soil loss that each field can lose a certain amount of soil each year and still be productive, not lose its productivity. And that's published by the USDA-Natural Resources Conservation Service. So we allow you to have that as long as you're meeting that soil loss tolerance over the rotation of the crop field. If it's corn and beans or corn and alfalfa or any combination that you have in there, as long as the soil loss is below T, you're good. The erosion sediment control plan will also look at your concentrated flow erosion. This is what you can see. It's gully erosion, as the picture is showing there. And the plan needs to identify areas of those areas of concentrated flow and whatever best management practices you would use to address those areas. The E&S plan also needs to identify near stream fields, and it requires at least a 25% cover of those near stream areas at all times. And then, as we talked earlier, it also requires you to identify animal heavy use areas and any best management practices that you need to address those areas. The NRCS conservation plan may be used to satisfy those requirements. And I think the next slide then goes to Mark. Correct. So Mark Goodson, the state agronomist, will present on the NRCS portion of this then.
Thank you, Frank. The Ag E&S regulations state that the portion of an NRCS conservation plan that identifies BMPs utilized to minimize accelerated erosion and sedimentation from agricultural plowing and tilling activities or from operation of heavy use areas may be used to satisfy the Ag E&S plan requirements if the subsection if it meets the requirements of paragraphs 1 through 4. So it's saying we need to meet the requirements of paragraphs 1 through 4. Next slide, please. Which include those items that Frank just mentioned: all cropland and pasture land that the farmer produces needs to be in the conservation plan. The acres all need to be planned to meet T over rotation and eliminate gullies. The plan has to be current and represent the current management of what the producer's doing on that farm, and the 25% near stream cover requirement, heavy use area management needs to be included. All that needs to be included in the plan or to be acceptable as an Ag E&S plan. Next slide, please. It's not safe to assume that a farmer that says he has a conservation plan has a plan that meets Ag E&S requirements. That's because of a lot of what NRCS does is called progressive conservation planning. And the conservation planning process is progressive when the plan addresses only a limited number of resource concerns or even a single resource concern, and consequently does not achieve an RMS or resource management system level of treatment. The rate of progress in moving to an RMS level plan will depend on the client's desires and constraints. So what that's saying is that conservation plans may not include all of the items that are required for the Ag E&S plan. And so we need to be aware of what kind of plan that NRCS produces could include those items. And what we have is a comprehensive nutrient management plan, a CNMP, that we require when producers want to get technical assistance or financial assistance for manure handling and storage and application. So the CNMP needs to meet NRCS planning criteria for both the production and land treatment areas, for water quality and the sediment and surface and groundwater, soil erosion, and air quality. Next slide. So the CNMP includes a Act 38 equivalent plan we call the 590 plan. It's a nutrient management plan that is written to the specifications of the Act 38 program. That includes near stream cover of 25% in that plan. All the land receiving manure must be included in the plan, and all that land must meet T and address gullies. Further, the engineering I&E portion of the CNMP addresses animal heavy use areas. So the CNMP may meet the requirements of an Ag E&S plan, but you need to be aware of the following caveats. Is all the land where plowing and tilling occurs in the plan, or is it simply the land treatment areas, the land receiving manure? So if the farmer has an operation maybe that's down the road from his animal production and land treatment application areas, it's important that those fields down the road, even if they don't include application of manure, be included in that farmer's plan. The plan needs to be available for inspection to DEP, and NRCS works with producers on a confidential basis. So the plan belongs to the farmer. So the farmer has to make the choice to share that plan for the purpose of Ag E&S. And it's not something that NRCS can share with any regulators. The plan needs to reflect the current management, and that means that the operations, the crop rotations, the tillage and residue management needs to be current as per what the operation is doing right now. And finally, it's important to recognize that DEP, not NRCS, determines whether parts of the conservation plan will meet the Ag E&S requirements. So that's next slide, please. Frank?
Yep, thank you, Mark. So the next portion of this presentation, we'll talk about nutrient and manure management planning. Mark alluded to the NRCS Comprehensive Nutrient Management Plan and having to use an Act 38 equivalent format. We'll get to that in a few slides here. Just wanted to let you know how these two things meld together. Next slide, Brian, please. So what we were discussing here, if you look at the circles on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a big, large blue circle, and it says AOs. Those are animal operations. And we roughly have about 24,000 animal operations in the state of Pennsylvania. If you look at the green circle with inside the blue circle, you'll see where we have CAOs. That's our concentrated animal operations. Again, those operations will be in our Act 38 program. We'll provide a little bit more information on that. So they have a higher level of plan than the animal operations. And we roughly have about 1,200 CAOs in the state. And then we have a light blue circle that's within portions of the green circle and the larger blue circle. Those are our concentrated animal feeding operations, or our CAFOs. Those are required to also have an Act 38 nutrient management plan, but they're also required to have a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permit, which Pennsylvania DEP issues on behalf of the federal EPA. So in Pennsylvania, all operations that generate or utilize manure, the AOs, the big blue circle, need to have a manure management plan. And that's regulated by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. Our concentrated animal operations are our CAOs. Those are high density animal farms where we have more than 2,000 pounds of animal density per acre of land available for manure application. Those CAOs are regulated by the Pennsylvania State Conservation Commission under the Act 38 program. They require an approved nutrient management plan that has to be written by a certified planner. They're reviewed by either conservation districts or the State Conservation Commission and approved. And those plans do require, they're public plans. There is public access to those plans in the counties where they're located. And then our lighter blue circle are CAFOs. They're based on either animal numbers or animal density. So any farm that has over 1,000 AAUs, any farm that's a CAO that has more than 300 animal equivalent units, or EPA also has a threshold of head numbers for each species. If you meet any one of those criteria, you would need to have a CAFO permit. With that CAFO permit, you need the approved nutrient management plan that's also done by a certified planner, and there's public access to that. The CAFOs, as I had mentioned earlier, are regulated by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection under a delegation agreement they have with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Next slide, please. So nutrient and manure management plans in Pennsylvania is any farm or entity that generates or land applies manure, if they produce or use manure, have to meet some level of state requirements. It's regardless of size. So you would need a manure management plan, regardless of the size. If you have a very small operation, 1 horse, by the regulations, you are required to have a manure management plan. Versus you could be a very large operation with several 100,000 broilers or layers. In that case, you would probably need an Act 38 nutrient management plan, but it depends on the acres you have available to apply that manure. It is regardless of the manure origin. So operations that are importing manure, they need to have those manure management plans. So you may not have farms, or you may not have animals on your farm, but if you're bringing manure in from somewhere else, you are required to have a manure nutrient management plan. And it's regardless of application type. So if you are mechanically applying it through a manure spreader, or it's directly applied by animals on pasture, you would need to have that manure management plan or nutrient management plan. Next slide, please. So Chapter 91 is our manure management. Again, this is regulated by DEP. Next slide. And this would be required on all farms unless you have a higher requirement. So Chapter 91.36 is the land application of animal manure and agricultural processed wastewater. The operation that produces or uses manure or processed wastewater must have and implement a written manure management plan in accordance with the manure management manual. It's very, you need to know on this that you need to have that manure management plan. It needs to be available on site and available for inspection, but it does not get reviewed or approved by the county conservation district or the state. The manure management plan can be developed by the farmer or other non-certified individuals. We see about a quarter of the plans maybe being written by farmers themselves, and the rest of them probably being written by certified professionals. Although the workbook is user-friendly and you can work through it on your own. It includes, the workbook has a standard format and standard worksheets in the manure management manual. If you wanted to use something different than the approved manure management manual, you need to get approval by DEP to use that process. Again, plans are not submitted for approval, but must be available on site. They must include, the manure management plan must include manure application rates, mechanical manure application setbacks. If you're planning on winter manure applications, you need to plan for that. If you have manure storage or stacking areas, we need to plan for the management of those areas. If you have pasture, we need to make sure we plan for pasture. And if you have animal concentration areas, either out in pasture fields or in the farmstead, such as a barnyard, we need to plan on how to manage them. Records are required to document the implementation. Again, the records do not get submitted anywhere, but they need to be available on the farm for inspection if asked for. Next slide, please. So there are several tools and resources that are available for you to do that. I have a hyperlink, and I think this presentation will probably be sent out after today. Or you can just Google Pennsylvania's Manure Management Plan Guidance. That will actually get you the workbook. If you're not computer savvy and you don't want to do that, you can always contact DEP, the State Conservation Commission, or the County Conservation District, and we can get you a workbook. That workbook does have several different chapters to it. One is the guidance on how to fill it out. 2 is an example manure management plan, and then 3 are some lookup charts for manure applications. There is a manure management plan administratively completeness review guide also on that webpage. That will tell you what a DEP staff person or a county conservation staff person will be looking for to make sure that the plan is administratively complete, that all the sections that are applicable are included. We have an animal equivalent unit calculator, which is an Excel file there as well, so you can see if you're going to be a CAO or not. And to go along with that, we have the Penn State Agronomy Fact Sheet number 54, which is a self-guided CAO calculation. It goes step by step on how to calculate your animal density, as well as it provides the standard weights that are approved by the State Conservation Commission. Next slide, please. The next part is our Act 38, which is Chapter 83 of 2000. So it's Act 38 of 2005, but it's Chapter 83 in the DEP regulations. Next slide, please. Again, these are for our concentrated animal operations. And the objectives of the Act 38 program are to preserve water quality in Pennsylvania. The Act creates nutrient management planning standards for certain agricultural operations. It requires the development of a nutrient management plan and/or nutrient balance sheets for exported manure. Again, it's administered by the State Conservation Commission, and we delegate the program to most conservation districts in Pennsylvania, but not all of them. And those districts that do not have or not delegated the program, the State Conservation Commission runs the program in that county. Next slide, please. So it requires the nutrient management plan, the Act 38 plan, which identifies the nutrient sources on the farm. It determines the application rates and any manure application restrictions. It describes how you're going to handle excess manure. It identifies other best management practices that may be needed. And just going back to when we talked about the erosion and sediment control, the nutrient management plan needs to be consistent with the erosion and sediment control plan or conservation plan. So the two plans need to complement each other, not contradict each other. So you can't have one that plans for corn and hay and then the other one plans for corn and soybeans. It just doesn't work that way. Those two plans need to coordinate with each other. We have nutrient balance sheets, which really are just simplified nutrient management plans. It's more of the land application portion of the nutrient management plan without all the other sections. Again, it determines manure application rates on importing farms. So if you're exporting manure off your farm or you're importing manure from an Act 38 operation, you should be getting a nutrient balance sheet that shows you how you're to apply that manure. And again, it focuses on the crop nutrient needs. So these are water quality plans, but they're also complementary of getting you the yield that you need. And Eric will touch base on that in a few minutes. Next slide. So what's included in the Act 38 nutrient management plan? Well, it includes more than just the manure application rates. We have mechanical manure application setbacks that must be followed. Your manure spreader should be calibrated, needs to be calibrated. We've provided some of that information in there. The actual calibration record you would keep on site for inspection. If you're applying winter manure in the winter, there are some additional steps that you need to go through and some additional calculations. If you have manure storages or stacking areas, we're going to get into some discussion on how those should be managed, as well as if you're pasturing animals or you have animal concentration areas. We want to have some discussion on the management of those and any best management practices that may be needed, as well as your cropland management. So if your Ag E&S or conservation plan is calling for a waterway to be installed or a terrace, that's also going to be included in your nutrient management plan. And this is where we go back to they have to complement each other and not contradict each other. And then the last portion of the nutrient management plan would be if you're exporting or importing manure and how we're going to manage that. Again, records need to be, just like the manure management plan, for nutrient management plans, records need to be kept to document your implementation. Those records are not submitted to the county or the State Conservation Commission. They're just kept on the farm and be available for inspection if needed. Next slide, please. So this is just a little slide that I stole. I'm not exactly sure whose presentation I stole it from. So it's the law of minimum, which was published in 1873. And it says if one growth factor or nutrient is deficient, plant growth is limited, even if all other vital factors or nutrients are adequate. Plant growth is improved by increasing the supply of the deficient factor or nutrient. So that's kind of what we're looking for. Again, these are water quality based plans, but we're keeping your yield in mind as well. So we want to make sure that we're providing the right nutrients for the yield that you want to get, but we're not over applying those nutrients. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who's going to do the Planning Plus. So thank you all.
Thank you, Frank. And Brian, we can go back to that law of the minimums slide, because that's a fairly important slide for people to think about. And I think the group that we have here today is split. We have a lot of plan writers and agency people that the slides that Mark and Frank had shared with us are the things you guys eat and breathe every day. You probably think about it when you're sleeping too. For the rest of the people on the call that are more on the commercial side, the certified crop advisors, that was a whole giant meat sandwich of regulatory things that farmers are complying with or trying to comply with in Pennsylvania. You have a lot of complexity and sometimes a lot of confusion on what kind of plans are needed. But from the certified crop advisors and ag retailer perspective, we want you to be aware of the plans that are necessary or needed by your customers, We want you to know who to go to if you have questions about those plans, who your local conservation district people are, your local NRCS staff. They're trained professionals. They're there to help you. They're there to help your farm customers do whatever it takes to move along that compliance journey. And yeah, like Frank had said, these plans are not intended to limit yield in any way, shape, or form. These plans are intended to kind of set the framework, almost give you the rules of the game so that you can go out and work towards implementing those plans and drive yield and move your farms along as much as we possibly can. Law of the minimum, like not much has changed since 1873. This graph still is just as pertinent today as it was back then. There's 18 essential nutrients that we have to drive yield. If we don't have all of them in the right ratios, in the right place, the right rates, the right time, we're not going to maximize yield. Without the right amount of zinc, we're never going to maximize phosphorus uptake in our fields. Without the right amount of sulfur, we're never going to maximize nitrogen uptake in our fields. So a lot of these things here that you see on this graph are just as relevant today as they were back in 1873. Some things have changed. You know, yield has changed. The importance of some factors over others certainly has changed. But when we're trying to use these plans in our day-to-day lives, we're kind of transitioning from plan development and making sure that our farmers are doing what they need to on the compliance part, and then starting to work with them on implementation. And there's a handful of things that we want to be able to point out in both of these plans, both a soil conservation plan and some kind of a nutrient plan that farmers can be using to help drive yield and drive production and make economic decisions on their farm. So Brian, let's go to the next slide. And as I was thinking about this presentation, trying to think of ways that farmers can use their conservation plans and their nutrient plans, I think the majority of the farmers that I work with don't fully appreciate or recognize the guidance that these plans provided. And I figure that it's up to me as being one of their trusted advisors to help be involved in these conversations and kind of move them through that process of plan implementation. My experience is that from a conservation district standpoint, nutrient management plan site visits and any kind of cost share contract meeting that you may be having with farms, those are awesome opportunities to pair the regulatory compliance with some 4R actions that are going to help bring some economics to the table to help them implement their plans. So I would divide conservation opportunities into three categories, one being business planning, second being an insurance policy, and then the third being profit decisions. What are we using these plans for? You can pretty much guess what farmers are using their plans for, and it really runs the gamut of people just taking that plan, putting it in their drawer and leaving it there until the next time they need it, to farmers really paging through and figuring out how they're going to get opportunity from this plan that you just wrote. So Brian, let's go to the next page and let's talk a little bit about business planning. When I'm working with my customers, because in addition to being executive director of the 4R Alliance, I'm an agronomist with Rosetree Consulting. So, my daily duties are going out and walking fields, looking for bugs and weeds, doing soil testing, making herbicide recommendations, and also doing nutrient plan writing as well. But when I'm talking to my customers about conservation, we're using it as a business planning tool, right? I want to be able to use that conservation plan to identify their environmental liabilities, the impacts of their existing enterprises, and the impacts of their potential enterprises. So each enterprise you can look at separately, right? So raising cattle is a separate enterprise from raising corn, which is a separate enterprise from raising wheat, right? They're all separate, and we need to evaluate some of the liabilities that each one of them have. We also want to be using these plans to identify the weaknesses in production. You can ask farmers, are you happy with your yields? And if they are, that's great. If they're not, it's time to start opening up some plans and figuring out where opportunities lie to move them in the right direction. We want to evaluate their operational resiliency. We know that as rainfall changes and it becomes more concentrated, and to get 3 inches of rain in 2 hours now, or a 5-inch rain every year is just the world that we live in. And so we want to make sure that our soils and our cropping production systems are set up that if we get dry spells, or if we get excessive heat, if we get gully washers, our system is set up to handle those things without having crazy amounts of yield loss occur in our corn or in our beans. And then last thing we want to do is we want to be able to game plan outcomes from potential management changes. And to me, that's what the nutrient management plan and the agronomy guide are set up to do. It's so easy to go in and game plan how we're going to change our applications and the outcomes of those applications would be. And you can put economic values directly to that. And we have some of that coming up in the next slides here. So let's jump to the next one. And here I wanted to kind of show you, like, when I'm talking to my customers and I'm looking at some of their liabilities, I'm going to divide it between things that are present in their soil conservation plan, things that are present in their nutrient plan. Soil loss and soil health, can't say enough about that. You know, it's never our unproductive soil that erodes. It's always that top layer of soil in the field that erodes. That's where our productivity is. That's where all of our nutrients are. That's where all the biological and microbial activity occurs in our soil. So anytime we have erosion, it's a direct link to economic losses on our farms. So those soil conservation plans are critical to figuring out if we're in the ballpark on soil loss or what kind of practices we should be looking to put on farms. You know, each conservation plan that you look at should have a T value, which is the soil's regenerative properties, how many tons per acre a year that soil can build. If you have your soil loss calculated above that, you're really in a world of hurt. If you have your soil loss calculated way below that, you're in great shape. It's that gray area where your soil loss is calculated right at T. And that's kind of where you get to have more conversations on bringing additional practices onto the farm that are going to help drive production and help increase yield. Other things that I like to talk about, you know, when we start looking at farms and looking at their soil conservation plan, what kind of operation they have, we really do need to be talking about farmstead ACA evaluations and pasture evaluations. We need to be honest about that. You know, the money it's going to take you to rebuild your beef cattle barn out there for your 7 beef cows, does that enterprise, is it going to return investment on all the money you're going to put into fixing that up? Same way with pastures. If a farm is not managing their pastures, you really need to sit down with them and say, what are you getting out of that pasture? Why are you using it? And just be honest about what they're using it for, what their intended purposes are, and then looking at some of the return on investment from the monies that they're going to have to invest in fixing those areas up. Because oftentimes, you know, the amount of money a farm has to put into fixing an old barn for 7 beef cows, it doesn't cost share. So from my perspective, that's something that I talk about with our farmers. From a nutrient planning perspective, looking at liability, phosphorus indexing and phosphorus loss, same way with nitrogen. Anytime we have the ability to look at loss pathways on a farm, that's something we definitely want to do. I like to use the nutrient plan to look at whether or not the existing land base can support the manure production that they currently have or the manure production that they're looking to go to, and then start looking at manure application setbacks. That's something that even our consulting CCAs or our ag retail CCAs want to be looking at, because where you have manure application setbacks on a farm, which is the majority of them that have manure or use manure, are going to have setbacks. You'll probably want to soil test those areas separately, make sure that you're looking at them differently to make sure that we don't have nutrient losses or nutrient deficiencies that we need to address separately from their manure applications. So that's a big one that I like to point out to people, that over time, if farms are following their manure application setbacks, you should be able to pick it up in the field with nutrient deficiencies and nutrient differences. So Brian, let's jump to the next slide. Business planning, like I mentioned earlier, being able to game plan some manure applications, I think, is important, particularly as 2022 unfolds and we have really high fertilizer prices right now. And so farmers are looking for any tool possible to increase nutrient use efficiency, increase retention. And the agronomy guide, the nutrient management plan, is a great tool for you to use to help them game plan some of those things, where you can pull out the Appendix 4 in a nutrient plan, or you can pull out that chart in the Penn State Agronomy Guide that lists manure availability factors. And you can do a 1 to 2 minute calculation with them to compare surface applications of dairy manure versus injection of dairy manure. Looking at applying chicken manure early fall or applying it late fall, using a cover crop versus no cover crop. These are all simple calculations that we can do to add economic value to the farms that we're working on. The same information is out there with fertilizer too, right? We all know that if we can ban phosphorus fertilizer, if we can ban nitrogen fertilizer, we're going to have a much higher use efficiency, which has a direct economic impact. Split applications of nitrogen. If you've listened to any of our webinars over the past year, we talked a lot about split applications of nitrogen and the value that those applications provide. Micronutrient additive needs, nitrogen modeling. We're going to talk about that in this webinar series. The next webinar that we're going to do is Dr. Charlie White talking about some of his advanced nitrogen management work. And then the third webinar in this series is going to be looking at some nitrogen modeling and adaptive practices. But so much of this game planning for fertilizer and manure applications, it starts with a simple manure analysis, and it starts with a simple soil test. We've got to make sure that we have our soil tests up to date for all the farms that we're working on. We got to make sure we have manure samples, even when we're doing a manure management plan that would not necessarily require a manure analysis for the farm. I want you to talk to your farmers about making sure that they're getting those manure analyses done, because it can have a big economic impact as we start calculating available nitrogen that's going to come from the different ways that they apply manure. It's low cost, it's big return. So don't skimp on the manure analysis costs, and don't skimp on the type of sampling that you do. If you're going to get just a general nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium analysis, it's only a couple of dollars more to get the ammonia nitrogen component, and it's only a couple of dollars more than that to get some of the micronutrient information. And all that stuff can be really important for us calculating nitrogen loads, calculating fertilizer needs as we move forward. So I think I have two examples that I wanted to go through with you here on manure applications and fertilizer applications. Let's jump into the manure example first. And some of this comes from other presentations that we've given over the past year. We did a webinar last year on low disturbance manure injection, or LDI, and comparing that versus a surface application. And we're back with some of that information in this presentation because there's great economic value that you can drive home to farmers right from their nutrient management plan based off of that information. So this is a dairy farm. We're applying 9,000 gallons. You can see what the total nitrogen is. You can see what the ammonia nitrogen analysis is. Then down below, we have the organic nitrogen availability and the ammonia nitrogen availability. Brian, I think if you click it one more time, some red circles come up. So when we're in the surface application, organic nitrogen availability doesn't change. It's 35%. We're really looking at that ammonia nitrogen availability. We surface apply that manure under a no-till situation. About 90% of the ammonia nitrogen just volatilizes, right? It's one of the 5 loss pathways that we talked about last year. Just goes away. It's lost, completely lost to us. We have no opportunity to recoup that nitrogen from the manure. If we hit the button again, Brian, it kind of moves over to where we have some injection information. The organic nitrogen availability doesn't change because that's the solids portion of the manure. The availability of that is 100% going to be based off of microbial activity, but that ammonia nitrogen availability is all based off of your management decisions and how we're advising farmers to handle their manure. Right? So if we can inject that liquid manure below the soil surface, even if it's only 2 or 3 inches, our ammonia availability jumps up 80%, right? Goes from 10% to 80%, 70% increase. Available nitrogen, let's keep on clicking through, Brian. Available nitrogen goes from 53 pounds, and we click it again, and it goes to 93 pounds. And you know what we can do is we can click it one more time, and you can look at the nitrogen savings from manure injection, right? It's a 2-minute calculation to do this. This is not impeding anybody from sitting down with their farmers and working through this exercise. Based off of today's fertilizer prices, injection of that 9,000 gallons of liquid dairy manure would improve the economic outcome of the farm by $27 an acre. We reduced our ammonia volatilization and our greenhouse gas emissions by over 70%. We've increased our nitrogen retention from our manure applications, reducing the amount of fertilizer that we have to purchase. A lot of good things have come from that low disturbance injection application. So that's a really simple calculation that you guys can do with all of your farms. Not only can you show them the difference between surface application and injection, but just as easy as showing them the difference in nitrogen retention from no cover crop versus a cover crop. And if we're talking about a late fall application or a winter application, or even an early spring application, we know that that cover crop presence has a really big influence on the amount of nitrogen we can retain from our manure applications. So keep that in mind. Would encourage you all, as you're sitting down with your farmers here over the next couple of months, to go through this exercise with them and just make sure that they're understanding the economic value that their manure application choices have, because it's coming right from your nutrient management plan. And it's those documents that we want farmers to have. So Brian, let's jump to the next one, and we're going to talk about fertilizer for a little bit. So we did a National Fish and Wildlife project this year with the 4R Alliance, and it was looking at split nitrogen applications, comparing farmers who were putting all of their nitrogen on up front, pre-emerge, right, pre-plant, versus farmers who are split applying their nitrogen, where they're taking a portion of their nitrogen and they're applying it up front before the corn emerges. They're taking the majority of their nitrogen and putting it on as a side dress application when the corn is V5, V6, which is before it gets knee high, right? So a portion of it before the corn is emerged, the rest of it before the corn is knee high. And then we're looking at the average yield between those two practices, right? So the average yield where people were putting all of their nitrogen on up front, 169 bushels. Average yield where they were willing to split apply their nitrogen, 183 bushels. Pretty big increase. Pretty simple to do the math on that one too, Brian. Let's click the button. And voila, change in farm revenue, $64.80 an acre, based off of split nitrogen applications and today's corn prices. That $64.80 increase in revenue also includes the cost of the split application, right? So if we're going to split apply that nitrogen, we're getting an extra cost associated with running the sprayer or running the equipment through the field again. And that is factored in to, it usually costs about $10 to $15 to run a tractor or a sprayer across the field. So we subtracted that $15 an acre from our total revenue change, and we still had about a $65 an acre advantage to split applying nitrogen. Great for our practice, right? We're taking the nitrogen that could have been applied before the corn came up, where it's exposed to a whole bunch of loss pathways for 30 to 60 days before the corn needs it. So we got 30 to 60 days worth of loss out there from those no split applications. And we're eliminating all that loss by positioning the nitrogen later in the growing season where the corn needs it. And we're getting better use efficiency of the fertilizer, better use efficiency of the dollars that we spend, and a whole lot less risk of loss into the environment. So Stacy had put a question into the chat here asking about what the percentage of available nitrogen be for surface applied manure when incorporated within 24 to 36 hours. And I would probably have to go back to the agronomy guide to look at that. But generally, the volatilization losses are the highest in the first 24 to 36 hours, that the amount of available nitrogen plummets the longer you let that manure out there to surface in a surface application window. So my recommendation to farms is, if they're going to do tillage, right, we want that tillage practice to occur within 24 hours of that application, because if it doesn't occur within 24 hours of the application, generally they're going to spend more on tillage than they will on the nitrogen savings, if that makes sense. So Brian, let's jump to the next slide here. And I want to talk about insurance policies a little bit. Nobody likes to talk about insurance policies, but sure enough, like your conservation plan, your nutrient plan, they are your insurance policy. Can't state that enough. It is important for farmers to understand that when you have a plan that's written correctly and a plan that is implemented properly, it gives you the insurance that you need. So we definitely want to make sure that farmers are thinking about that when they're looking at how to use their plans. And then let's jump to the next slide, Brian. And I want to try to move along here a little bit quicker. Profitability. Profitability is so important for farmers, right? There is nothing that is a bigger driver for the decisions that they make than just profitability on an acre, profitability on a head of cattle. You name it, there's some profitability metric that they're using, and that is probably the biggest driver that they're using in their decision making. From looking at your conservation plans and your nutrient plans, we want to identify the weaknesses in the production cycle. We want to look for barriers. We want to look for opportunities to save and to reallocate. And we want to look at where our yield increases are going to come from, right? Corn probably increases at an average rate of 2 bushels per acre per year. So if you're looking at a nutrient management plan for an operation that was submitted to your agency 10 years ago, and you compare it to what it is today, there should be a 20 bushel advantage in this plan based off of where we were. So just keep that in mind. That's an important thing to consider. Yields should be going up, right? It takes about 3 times as much energy to produce a bushel of soybeans as it does a bushel of corn. So if average corn yields are going up by 2 bushels, average soybean yields should be going up by about 3/4 of a bushel. And if you look at the Corn Growers Association website, their 5-acre corn club contest, if you look at the soybean board's 5-acre soybean contest, it shows that yields are going up over time. Yields are typically going up faster for farmers that are adopting practices like no-till, like variable rate applications, precision ag things. Yields go up faster. So anyway, let's jump to the next slide here, Brian, and talk a little bit more about some of the profitability things and just looking at where we're going to find profitability conversations within our planning. So I think profitability probably has more than 4 different factors, but I could only really think of 4 different factors or take the time to focus on 4 factors. I want to focus on number 1, increasing yield, because increasing yield is going to be important for our customers staying in business over the next 5 to 10 to 20 years. If they're not increasing yield, they're going to be falling behind and we're going to have big problems. Second thing is reducing cost. Third thing is increasing the per unit pricing of what they sell. And then the last thing that I think we should touch on is alternative revenue sources, because this particular group is going to be well suited to help our farmers tap into some of those alternative revenue sources. So let's jump into the first one here, and we're going to talk about increasing yield. All right, so I want to talk about soybean yield. And what we need to do to increase soybean yield, right? So if you're a farmer and you are not satisfied with your soybean yields, and you're going to talk to your agronomist, you're going to talk to your advisors about what do you need to do to increase soybean yields on your property. Honestly, me as the 4R guy, I'm going to tell you, hey, we need to implement 4Rs. And then the next question should be, well, where are we going to implement them, right? Because sure, we're going to implement 4Rs on fertility, and we're going to talk about the right source of our nutrients. We're going to talk about the right rate that our fertilizers should be applied at, when's the best time to apply them, and the best placement for optimal uptake, right? But you could really overlay that on seeding practices, making sure that we have the right variety chosen, that it's planted at the opportune planting date, that the population is correct for that variety, and that it's put in the right field with the right soil conditions. So 4Rs can relate to seed, can also relate to pesticide choices, it can relate to environmental interactions. If we want to increase our soybean yield, we have to address all of those, right? And just quick math, that's 16 different things we need to look at in order to improve our soybean yield, right? So we have to make sure that our seed depth is right, seed uniformity is right, the seeding rates are right. Need to make sure that potassium and sulfur fertility are right. How about something like leaf area index being maximized by that first reproductive growth stage? That's important for soybean yield, right? So this picture we have down the bottom right-hand corner is a soybean plant that is flowering, right? It's in that R1, R2 growth stage. And each one of those nodes that you see right there has the ability to produce about 8 to 10 flowers and retain 8 to 10 pods. So simple exercise for increasing soybean yields. Number 1, how many nodes can we produce on a plant? Number 2, how many flowers can we get that plant to produce? And 3, how many of those flowers will retain pods, right? Pretty simple thing to do for increasing soybean yields, but it gets really complicated, because in order to have a lot of nodes, I need to have the planting date right, and I need to have the populations correct. I need to have the variety selected for the site. I need to have, in order to get flowering, I need to have environmental conditions spot on. I need to have my fertility levels where they need to be. If I want to have those flowers turn into pods, I need to have my sulfur levels right. I need to have my nitrogen levels right. Nitrogen, not something that we think about a lot in soybean production, but most soybean plants have the ability to produce enough nitrogen for 40 to 50 bushels of yield, and our customers are getting 80 to 100. So where does the rest of the nitrogen come from if it's not coming from biological production within the plant? And the answer is it's coming from mineralized nitrogen in the soil and from your cover crops. So if we want to be able to help people increase the yields on soybeans, anything we can do to have more mineralized nitrogen late in the season is going to pay back dividends to us in making those flowers turn into pods, and those pods turn into full-size beans, right? So we need to have all that with enough water, with enough sunlight, with enough potassium, everything else. Mineralized nitrogen is something that you can talk to farmers about through their conservation plan, right? Yep, we can start talking about BMPs for increasing yield. Basic nutrient management is going to be important for these soybeans. We want soil tests. We want the soil tests that are within 2 years. We want to make sure their potassium levels are okay. We want to make sure their sulfur levels are okay. Want to be doing some advanced nutrient management things. Larger field sizes that are over 20 acres. When do we start looking at advanced soil testing and variable rate applications on these fields? Because there is subfield management variability. There's variability that exists. How do we manage it? We got to be able to figure that out for some of our larger field sizes. No-till and cover crops, right? If you look at the Corn Growers Association contest, if you look at the soybean boards contest, almost everybody that is participating in those contests is a no-tiller, right? They're continuous no-till. They're doing soil health practices. It's very rare to find somebody doing tillage in those contests here in Pennsylvania. And no-till, getting 300 bushel corn and 100 bushel beans is the expectation right now for our contest participants. So that takes an awful lot of nutrient cycling from the soil. That takes an awful lot of things going right within that soil profile. And a lot of it comes back to the soil health practices that you all are out there advocating for. We need successful no-till. We need soil structures that are set up to infiltrate water so that the water goes down into the soil profile instead of running off. We need nutrient cycling to be occurring at a high rate, and we need mineralization to be occurring at a very high rate too. Some of that comes back to your cover crop decisions. When you're advising farms on cover crops for soybeans, do we need to be looking at cover crop species that are going to have a quicker mineralization turnaround time for when those crops are terminated in the spring to when that nitrogen can get back into our soybean crop? And the answer is probably yes, we do. If we're going to have economic responses from cover crops in a cash crop like soybeans, it's going to be because mineralization is occurring at a favorable time where the soybeans can take advantage of it. So other thing that I think we should be talking about for BMPs that I didn't put up here is integrated pest management, right? Any certified crop advisor on the call today is thinking to yourself, Eric, like, we're not talking about fungicides, we're not talking about herbicide safety, like, where does all that fit in? And it definitely does, right? When you look at those environmental interactions and pesticide choices, we've got to make sure, number one, that we're getting decent weed control and really good control of diseases and insects. Those choices are going to be made in season. It's going to take somebody out there in the field, but we see the data coming in from our customers and the plots that they're putting out, that when they're taking the time to add extra things into their pesticide management portfolio, it's returning dividends to them. Fungicides being a big one, right? Where we have disease pressure in soybeans, whether it's brown spot, whether it's sudden death syndrome or any of those root rots, whether it's frog eye leaf spot or white mold, the application of a fungicide is making a difference. It's helping you increase your phosphorus removal. It's helping you increase your nitrogen removal. And it's something that is right there in an integrated pest management plan that people can write into a conservation plan. So let's jump to the next one, Brian. And there was a webinar last week, and I don't know how many of you caught it, but it was through the Soil Health Institute. And so the Soil Health Institute started off as an extension, I believe, of the National Corn Growers Association, and has become an entity of its own. But they did a really great study interviewing 100 farms and asking those 100 farms what kind of soil health practices they're doing on their farms, right? So out of those 100 farms, and most of them are Midwest farms, but 67% of them reported increased yields due to soil health. Right. So in their definition of soil health is continuous no-till, integration of cover crops, and 4R practices. All right. And those 4R practices we have listed down below. But the average revenue change on those farms, $51 an acre in corn, $45 an acre in soybeans. That's a huge difference, right? People that are doing what they consider a soil health suite of practices, where you've got no-till cover crops and infield 4R practices, gaining an extra $50 an acre from their corn production, gaining an extra $45 an acre in their soybean production. That's huge. That's over 7 bushels of corn per year and just around 3 bushels of beans per year. Out of that $51 and $45, some of it comes from fertilizer reductions, from doing advanced soil testing and variable rate applications, right? 86% of the farms that were doing no-till and cover crops were also doing advanced soil testing. Okay, they're doing grid sampling, they're taking their yield maps and they're creating zones and doing soil testing based on zones. They're implementing variable rate, whether it's variable rate limestone or whether it's variable rate P and K, maybe it's variable rate nitrogen, depending on the script that they set up. But 82% of the respondents were implementing those type of 4R practices. And 89% were implementing split application of nitrogen, which really goes back to the slide we had earlier with our Adams County data, showing you the differences between all the nitrogen up front and what a split application can do. I think one of our 4R members from the mill is on the call today, but the mill had a wonderful research plot at one of their field days this year, where they looked at a number of different cover crop species and mixes and compared that with handling of nitrogen and looking at adaptive management of nitrogen in a field. And it was a great experiment to show right here locally what the interaction of cover crops and advanced nutrient management can do for a farmer. And from my looking at the plots and being involved in the field day, I would concur that what the Soil Health Institute found from those Midwest farms is absolutely replicated here in the Mid-Atlantic region, with people pairing 4R practices with their soil health practices. All right, so that $51 an acre in corn, that the revenue increase, obviously that net revenue increase came from an increase in yield, but it also came from a reduction in fertilizer costs. About $22 of that 51 was 4R related fertilizer reductions and reallocation of the fertilizers that they were applying to a field. The rest of it, certainly yield increases due to the whole system, due to the soil health practices, plus the 4Rs. So if you want to read a little bit more about this study, I encourage you all to go to the Soil Health Institute /economics, and you'll find your way to that report. Interesting read, and I encourage you all to check it out, because I think it will give you information that you need to help implement your conservation plans and your nutrient plans. So let's jump to the next slide. And so now here we're talking about just reducing input costs. I will tell you that most farmers that we work with, they're going to tell you that reducing cost is not as important as driving yield. It's not. Yield is the driver for decision making, but it doesn't mean that farms want to overspend or over apply on inputs, because number one, high yield does not always mean high profit, and number two, they're always looking for a way to manage input costs based off of expected revenue and just make choices that make their dollar go farther. So reducing input costs can be a very big part of what agronomists do working with their farmers, but it's also something that needs to be paired with increasing yield, because I can't reduce input costs so much that it reduces yield, right? I can either reduce input costs and have yield be maintained, or ideally I can reduce or reallocate input costs and have yield go up, right? That's the goal. We want to be able to manage those input costs and have yield continue to go up through time. In order to do that, I need people to understand what their true costs of production are. That's something that anybody can have a conversation with a farmer on. The next time you're talking to somebody about signing up for EQIP or CSP, ask them if they know what their cost of production is on corn or on soybeans and where their pitfalls are. Ask them what the upfront cost of a BMP is, right? If they want to go and do no-till or do more cover crop, ask them if they calculate what that upfront cost is going to be and how fast it returns value, because it's something that you can help them with, right? You can help them do that calculation through some of the tools that's available to us through NRCS. And next thing that I think we need to have a really hard conversation is, are we reducing our inputs, or are we simply just going to reallocate them to a different part of the field, right? We start doing more with precision ag and understanding that a 20-acre field is going to have spots that doesn't need any fertilizer, and there's going to have spots in that same field that need 3 times the amount of fertilizer that you would have recommended, right? So I think we need to start looking long and hard on larger field sizes, how we manage that subfield variability, and what we're telling farmers about the reallocation of their resources across that field, right? So BMPs for managing our production costs, for me, it starts a lot with our soil tests and our manure samples. I think we've got to have those things in place. That's the baseline for our decision making. Advanced nutrient management certainly comes right behind it. I think we've all read enough and listened to enough webinars talking about split nitrogen applications, talking about low disturbance manure injection to know that those advanced 4R practices return dollars in farmers' pockets, and they have a water quality benefit, right? Those 2 practices are going to help farmers meet their nutrient management plannings. They're going to help farmers meet water quality goals in the Chesapeake Bay. They're easy practices that farmers can look at. Higher level advanced nutrient management practices, like using yield data to drive zone delineation, to do variable rate applications. Those are all things that farmers are going to look at over time. There's a cost associated with it, but there's a long-term benefit in being able to manage and reallocate the resources that they're using on fields. No-till and cover crops, that's also something that we've talked about for years, right? When no-till first came on the market back in the 1990s, you know, our farm in Berks County, we knew exactly how many tanks of diesel fuel it took to chisel plow and disc and plant our corn. And once we switched to no-till, we can also tell you how many tanks of diesel fuel it took to plant our 100 acres of corn, and it was one tank of diesel fuel. That's a huge reduction in energy use. It's a huge reduction in labor needs. Some of that was very pertinent back in the 1990s and the 2000s, where we have a very wide transition of people going from conventional tillage into no-till. But don't let those numbers get lost on you today. You know, we're still trying to have people move towards a continuous no-till system, and those type of numbers are still just as true today as they were back in the day. And cover crops. Cover crops, I think we want to spend a good bit of time talking to customers about to figure out how much nitrogen a cover crop is going to supply to their system and how much they need to invest in that cover crop seed in order to get to where they want to go on nitrogen contributions. So Charlie White's done a lot of work on this topic, and I think we'll have more information for you in later webinars on that, but that's going to be a very interesting topic for 2022 with high fertilizer prices the way that they are. So Brian, let's jump to the next slide. Increasing pricing. There's not a lot that you can glean out of a nutrient management plan or a conservation plan that's going to help a farm increase their pricing, right? They're going to increase the pricing by forward contracting, by taking a look at either non-GMO or organic production, or taking a look at like a high value or high quality product, much like soybeans that have high oleic acid in them, right? You can get a premium for selling plenished soybeans to Purdue, and they're still growing soybeans in their field, but they're getting a premium for growing a high oil product that has a higher consumer demand, right? So they can increase their pricing in those ways. But there's really no BMPs that we can look at yet. I think the biggest questions that we need to be asking ourselves when we're thinking about nutrient plans and when we're thinking about conservation plans is, number one, will there be a premium for sustainably sourced products? Because if that time comes, it's going to go directly back to your conservation plan and making sure that you have a plan that verifies sustainability on your farm. And the second question is, when will buyers of your grain, when will buyers of your milk or of your chickens want verification, right? When will they want some kind of a blockchain computerized verification start to finish of the practices that you did on your farm and how that animal got to market? When are those things coming, right? Because they're coming. It's just a matter of how soon and how prepared are we as advisors and how prepared are we as farmers to do it. So having your nutrient management plan, having your soil conservation plan, step number one to getting in the door to increase pricing from both of those things. So I always talk to our farmers and say, look, I don't know when these things are going to happen, but I think we're going to see it in the short to medium term. Let's get set up now and make sure that when your milk processor comes to you, when your chicken integrator comes to you, that we're prepared and we've got what you need. So let's jump to the next slide. Alternative revenue sources. Like I said earlier, I think this group here is well positioned to help farmers capitalize on alternative revenue sources, right? NRCS is wonderful for having products that farmers can use to help reimburse them for trying new things, for adopting practices that move the needle on nutrient use efficiency, for fixing that heavy use area. We want farmers enrolled and involved in NRCS and talking to them to figure out what kind of things are coming down the road that they should be looking at and taking advantage of. REAP tax credits, wildly successful program in Pennsylvania. We have so many of our customers taking advantage of REAP for their corn planters, for cover crops, for structural things, you name it. The REAP program is out there. Got to have your manure management plan. Got to have your soil conservation plans in order if you're going to take advantage of REAP tax credits. So we do talk to our customers and talk to them about REAP. And if they're thinking of using REAP, work ahead with their conservation district, with their NRCS office, or with us, and make sure that those plans get developed and get implemented. Other agency and NGO cost sharing, it's out there. You have nonprofit groups and environmental organizations that are out trying to help reimburse farmers for cover crops or help implement more advanced nutrient management practices. And farmers should keep their ears open for those type of opportunities and use them if it fits their operation. And the last thing I have up here, carbon credits and greenhouse gas credits. And I specifically put them differently, right? Carbon credits in Pennsylvania, I'm not exactly sure how we're going to be able to take advantage of those, because most of the carbon credit markets are paying for new practices. And here in Pennsylvania, we have a lot of existing practices. We have farmers that have been doing no-till for 20 years, and they're not going to be eligible for some carbon markets. Maybe they can adopt a cover crop and get a little bit of money for that. But maybe our bigger opportunity is coming down the road with other greenhouse gases, looking at nitrogen losses from fertilizers and from manures, and looking at practices that can reduce that loss and seeing if there are payments on the market for that. So keep your eye open for that. I think the greenhouse gas carbon credit market is in its infancy, and we're in for a wild ride here in the next couple of years, and we'll see where it shakes out and what opportunities are available for Pennsylvania farmers. So let's jump to the next slide here, Brian. I think we're starting to wind down. Yeah, let's talk about our SARE project. So Brian had talked a little bit earlier about our farm advisor program that we want to set up here in the next couple of years. And our goal is to have people in the conservation district, NRCS agency staff, or CCAs that are looking to further their knowledge of 4Rs and go through a forward-thinking learning cohort with them, where at the end, they're going to be better suited to advise their farmers on in-field practices like split application, like precision ag, like low disturbance manure injection, and just have better, more effective conversations with farmers on implementing planning. We're looking for about 30 advisors here in the Chesapeake Bay watershed and also outside of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So if you or if anybody within your organization is interested in learning more, reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you and share more information on the program with you. You can take a picture of the QR code right there, and it'll take you right to our website and registration so that you can start that process. But we'd love to have you, and we're excited about the project and increasing 4R knowledge within advisors throughout the state. So Brian, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you to all our presenters. It's excellent. I guess it might be good to start off with questions before I get into continuing education credits. It looked like maybe it'd be good to start with Brandy's question, which I believe was back at Eric's split nitrogen slide. And Brandy's question was soil productivity considered in this change in yield between the split N and the not split N applications?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Brandy, and I'm sorry I didn't see that, or else I would have addressed it during the presentation. So these would have been side-by-side comparisons where the participating farmers, they were asked to have, let's say they enrolled one farm in the project. We needed at least one side-by-side comparison in the same field. So that way we could do yield comparisons in the same soil type with the same variety with the same environmental exposures. So, and even with that, the average yield difference was over 20 bushels.